Welcome to Whispering Cabins, where eerie tales meet gentle comfort. Tonight's collection is filled with stories that chill like a cool breeze through an open window, yet warm like candlelight on a quiet night. Settle in, let your thoughts drift, and allow these soothingly spooky tales to guide you into sleep. Sweet dreams, if the night allows. Tonight's first story is called The Box in the Attic. The Ashfords had never expected to end up in Maple Hollow. The small New England town was tucked away on the edge of a lake, its streets lined with sugar maples and white-steepled churches. When Daniel and Claire first pulled up the gravel drive with their 2 children, the house felt like something from a storybook. Cedar shingles weathered to soft grey, wide porches with curling vines, and windows that glowed warmly in the late afternoon sun. "It's perfect," Claire had whispered, squeezing Daniel's hand. But old houses carry their histories in quiet ways. The first week passed without much notice. They unpacked, hung curtains, and tried out the creaky clawfoot tub. The children, Anna, 12, and Jonah, 8, ran through the rooms, delighted by the house's quirks. A hidden cupboard under the stairs, glass knobs that caught the light like jewels, wallpaper yellowed but patterned with tiny climbing roses. It was Anna who first noticed the rocking chair. Every evening, when she checked on Jonah after he fell asleep, the old chair in the corner would be moving gently, as if rocked by a breeze. The windows, though, stayed shut tight. "It's not scary," she insisted one morning over oatmeal. "It's like someone's sitting with him, watching." Daniel chuckled. "Houses creak, drafts move things, that's all." But Claire frowned. She had smelled lavender the night before while folding laundry, a scent faint and fleeting, though no soaps or sachets in the house carried it. By the second week, there were whispers. Not words exactly, but soft humming, drifting down from the attic after dark. The melody was slow, mournful, yet strangely tender. Daniel tried to laugh it off. "Settling beams," he said, "the wind." But one night, as he lay awake beside Claire, he heard it clearly, low, human, unmistakable. The next day, curiosity overcame denial. They decided to investigate the attic together. The attic was a world apart from the rest of the house. Dust motes swam in the lantern light, and the air was thick with cedar and old paper. Boxes leaned tiredly against each other, and quilts lay folded in brittle heaps. The humming had stopped when they opened the hatch, leaving only silence, taut and waiting. It was Jonah who pointed to the corner. "There," he said softly. Beneath the quilt spotted with age was a wooden box, no larger than a bread loaf, bound with a brass latch dulled by years. Claire lifted it onto a trunk. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then with a careful hand, Anna undid the latch. Inside lay pressed violets, their color faint but intact, a bundle of sepia photographs, and a small diary bound in cracked leather. Across the first page, written in an elegant looping script, was a name: Margaret Hale. The Ashfords took turns reading the diary by lantern light. Margaret had lived in the house more than a century before. Her entries painted a portrait of a life both ordinary and tender, tending gardens, hosting neighbors for tea, baking bread in the big stone oven. But as the pages turned, the writing grew heavier. Margaret's husband, Samuel, had been a sailor who never returned from his last voyage. Loneliness seeped into the entries. She wrote of humming to herself at night to fill the silence. She pressed flowers to keep beauty close when her garden failed. She dreamed of children in the halls, but bore none of her own. The final entry was short, the ink blurred by what might have been tears. September 3rd, 1892. The nights are so long. I only hope this house remembers me kindly when I am gone. When Anna finished reading aloud, the attic seemed to exhale. The lantern's flame steadied, and the faint scent of lavender filled the air, sweet and unmistakable. From then on, the haunting softened. The rocking chair swayed only at night, and Jonah reported feeling tucked in by something unseen. Anna often found the vase of wildflowers she'd left on the attic sill rearranged, tidier, more deliberate, as though someone had taken the time to care for them. Claire began to hum while she cooked, and sometimes, impossibly, a second voice joined hers for just a note or two, like harmony. There were still moments of unease, a cold brush of air when no windows were open, the sound of footsteps on the landing late at night, but the Whitakers grew used to them. Margaret Hale was no longer a shadow lurking in the corners. She was part of the rhythm of the house, as woven into it as the beams and floorboards. One night in October, as leaves rattled across the porch, Anna sat up in bed and whispered into the dark, "We found your box. We know who you are." The lavender scent bloomed suddenly, filling the room. The rocking chair shifted once, then stilled. Anna smiled. For the first time, the humming from the attic sounded less like sorrow and more like a lullaby. In Maple Hollow, neighbors often said the Whitaker house had a glow about it. Visitors noticed the warmth, the way the air felt soft and lived in. Few knew the truth, that a woman long gone still lingered there, not to frighten, but to keep watch. But as the months passed, the Ashfords noticed something strange. The flowers Anna left on the attic sill began to wither faster, as though plucked of their life. Claire woke some mornings with the taste of salt on her lips, like she had been crying in her sleep. Jonah once swore that a pale woman sat on the edge of his bed, brushing his hair back from his forehead with ice-cold fingers. And though Margaret's humming still floated through the attic at night, it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded full, stronger, almost as if the house itself was remembering how to breathe again. Story 2. The Woman in the Photographs. The Victorian house creaked when Margaret first turned the key in its iron lock. She had bought the place sight unseen, drawn by the price and by the wistful description in the listing, an elegant home with timeless character. To her, it was a chance to start fresh. She had left a city job, a relationship that had long since soured, and wanted nothing more than quiet nights, the smell of old wood, and the sound of wind against stained glass. The house stood 3 stories tall, with a mansard roof and a porch lined with carved spindles. Dust lay thick inside, but underneath, Margaret sensed a presence, not quite threatening, but watchful, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. On her 3rd evening there, while unpacking in the attic, she found the box. It was shoved into a corner beneath a faded quilt, its lid warped with age. Inside lay bundles of black and white photographs, the edges curled and brittle. She held one to the light. A family stood on the front steps of the very house she now owned. A stern man with heavy sideburns, a woman in lace, and 2 young girls clutching parasols. But it wasn't the family that made her heart stutter. In the far left corner of the photo, half hidden in shadow, stood another woman, her face nearly identical to Margaret's. Margaret froze. She thought at first it must be a trick of resemblance, the way people sometimes see echoes of themselves in old portraits. But as she sifted through more photographs, the likeness became undeniable. In picture after picture, from picnics in the yard to gatherings in the parlor, the woman appeared. Sometimes blurred, sometimes clear, but always present, always watching, and always looking exactly like her. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the tall parlor windows, the photographs spread around her. Who was this woman? Why had no one mentioned her in the brief historical notes she'd found online about the house? At dawn, unable to resist, she walked into town to the Historical Society. An older librarian, Mrs. Wexler, helped her dig through bound ledgers and brittle newspapers. The house, she learned, had belonged to the Hallowells, a wealthy family that settled there in the mid-1800s. The patriarch, Charles Hallowell, died young in a riding accident. His wife and daughters carried on for a time, but the records grew sparse after the 1870s. What about other residents? Margaret asked. Mrs. Wexler hesitated. There were whispers, even back then, of a companion who came to stay. A cousin, or so they said, though she wasn't listed in census records, and no one seemed to know where she'd come from. Do you know her name? The librarian frowned, scanning a ledger. Only one mention. A note in the town journal calls her the other Miss Hallowell. No first name. Strange, isn't it? Margaret felt a chill at the phrase. Over the following week, Margaret dreamed often of the photographs. In the dreams, she wandered the halls of the house, the wallpaper fresh, lamps glowing with gaslight. Voices filled the rooms. She would catch sight of herself in a mirror, but it wasn't herself. It was the woman from the photographs, wearing high collars and heavy skirts, eyes as steady and solemn as her own. During the day, small things unsettled her. A mirror in the upstairs hallway seemed to ripple when she passed. In the attic, she sometimes heard soft footfalls, though the dust never stirred. And once, as she set a cup of tea down, she realized she had poured 2 cups without thinking. One morning, she sat with the photographs again, running her fingers over the brittle paper. A detail she hadn't noticed before leapt out at her. In several of the pictures, the woman, her twin, wore a locket, a silver oval with a filigree edge. Margaret's pulse quickened. She had seen that very locket. She ran upstairs to the bedroom. When she'd moved in, she'd found a small jewelry box left in the closet, mostly empty except for one item, a silver oval locket, its filigree edge worn smooth by time. Margaret held it in her palm now, feeling its faint warmth. She opened it. Inside was a faded miniature portrait of the Hallowell house. On the other side, her stomach tightened, was a lock of hair, dark and coiled. That night the dreams grew stronger. The woman spoke this time, though Margaret couldn't hear her words. Her lips moved, forming something urgent, pleading. When Margaret awoke, her pillow was damp, as though she'd been weeping in her sleep. She spent the next day combing the archives again, until she found a final clue in a faded newspaper clipping. Mysterious disappearance at the Hallowell residence. The companion to the family, known only as the other Miss Hallowell, vanished without trace in the autumn of 1874. Some say she ran off, others whisper of darker ends. Margaret stared at the clipping until the words blurred. The date, 1874, was exactly 150 years ago. The house grew restless as October deepened. Floorboards groaned even when she sat still. The stained glass windows seemed to hold shifting shadows that didn't match the trees outside. On the last night of the month, Margaret returned to the attic. She brought the photographs and the locket with her, as though compelled. The moon cast pale light across the floorboards. She laid out the photographs in a line, her own face staring back again and again from a century and a half ago. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of lilacs, though none bloomed at this time of year. "Who are you?" Margaret whispered. In the silence, the locket grew hot in her palm. Then the mirror propped against the attic wall shivered, like water disturbed. Slowly, an image swam into view, the parlor as it had been long ago, glowing with lamplight. And there, standing among the Hallowells, was the other Miss Hallowell. She lifted her face. Margaret looked into her own eyes. The woman smiled faintly, sorrowfully, and mouthed a word. Margaret thought she saw her own name. The glass rippled once more, and this time the image didn't fade. It drew closer. Margaret staggered back, but her reflection stayed where it was, watching. The woman in the mirror reached forward, her hand pressing against the glass from the other side, and Margaret's hand lifted to meet it, without her willing it to. A chill surged through her body. The attic tilted, shadows spun, and when she blinked, she was no longer standing on the dusty boards. Gaslight flickered above. The wallpaper was new. Music drifted from the parlor below. She looked down at her hands, gloved, pale, trembling. A silver locket hung heavy around her neck. In the mirror, her reflection smiled. Not her own smile, but the other Miss Hallowell's. Margaret tried to scream, but no sound came. Only the lilac-scented air and the quiet certainty that she had not moved into the house. She had come home. Story 3. The Forest of Gifts. Ethan was 8, the first time he strayed past the crumbling stone wall at the edge of his grandmother's property. Beyond the mossy barrier stretched an old forest, dark and close, where the trees leaned together as if they were whispering secrets. His grandmother had warned him never to go there. "It's not a place for children," she'd said, her wrinkled hands tightening on her teacup. "The forest gives, but it always takes in return." Ethan, being curious and bold in the way children often are, found the warning irresistible. On a grey afternoon, while his grandmother napped in her rocking chair, he slipped out the back door and climbed over the wall. The air inside the forest was different, cooler, thicker, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine needles. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in fractured beams, but the further Ethan walked, the more the light seemed to fade. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, though his heartbeat felt louder than usual in the quiet. Then he saw it, a small wooden box sitting at the base of a birch tree, as if someone had left it there just for him. The box was tied with a faded red ribbon. He hesitated, then knelt and tugged it open. Inside lay a toy soldier, carved from wood, painted with meticulous care. Its little musket was chipped, and its uniform faded, but to Ethan, it was wonderful. He gasped, clutching it to his chest. When he looked up, the trees seemed closer somehow. He thought he heard a sigh ripple through the branches, though there was no breeze. He hurried home with his prize. That night, when his grandmother saw the soldier, her face went pale. "Where did you get that?" she demanded. Ethan tried to explain, but she silenced him with a shake of her head. "Return it tomorrow. Do not keep what the forest gives." But Ethan didn't listen. The toy soldier sat proudly on his bedside table, and when he dreamed of marching drums and shining bayonets. A week later, Ethan returned. This time, he found a silver coin resting on a flat stone. He picked it up, the metal cold against his palm, and felt a shiver of excitement. He bought sweets with it at the village shop, and for days he thought himself lucky. But at home, his grandmother stumbled on the stairs, injuring her hip. She winced in pain for days, muttering about debts that always come due. Still, Ethan could not resist. Each time he ventured into the forest, there was another gift waiting. A book of stories bound in green leather, a pocket knife with a pearl handle, a red scarf that never seemed to soil. He brought them all home, though he noticed that every gift was followed by something unpleasant. The kitchen clock stopped ticking. A neighbor's dog disappeared. His grandmother's health weakened. One evening, as autumn crept close and the forest grew heavy with mist, Ethan went again. This time, no gift lay neatly waiting. Instead, a path seemed to open between the trees, lined with mushrooms that glowed faintly in the dimness. He followed. The path led him to a clearing he had never seen before. In its center stood a great oak, its trunk twisted and gnarled, its roots sprawling like the limbs of some giant creature. At the base of the oak was a hollow, and from within it spilled a soft golden light. Ethan peered inside. There, piled high as treasure, lay toys, books, coins, and trinkets. Gifts from the forest, too many to count. Some looked ancient, dust-covered. Others gleamed as if newly made. A voice, low and velvety, drifted through the hollow. "Take what you wish, child." The forest is generous. Ethan swallowed hard. His fingers itched to reach inside, but his grandmother's words tugged at him. The forest gives, but it always takes in return. "What will it take?" he whispered. The voice chuckled. "Only what you no longer need. A moment of joy here, a year of time there. Nothing you'll miss. Until it's gone." Ethan backed away. "No, I don't want anything else." But the forest seemed to lean in around him, branches arching overhead, roots shifting beneath his feet. From the shadows of the clearing, pale figures began to emerge. Children, dozens of them, their faces faintly glowing, their eyes wide and empty. Each one clutched an object, a doll, a marble, a necklace, a book. Ethan recognized the toy soldier among them. They kept their gifts, the voice purred, and so they stayed. The figures swayed gently, like trees in the wind. Their lips did not move, but Ethan heard a whisper all the same. "Stay with us. Stay forever." Terror surged through him. Ethan dropped the red scarf, the silver coin, the pocket knife, all the things he had taken onto the forest floor. "I don't want them anymore," he cried. The clearing stilled. The pale children froze, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The voice sighed, like the creak of old wood. "Then go, boy. But remember, what is given cannot be forgotten. Someday, you will return." The path behind him opened, and Ethan ran. He did not stop until he scrambled back over the stone wall and collapsed in the grass, gasping. That night, he placed all the gifts he had taken, the soldier, the book, the scarf, into a sack, and dragged it outside. He left it by the wall, too afraid to bring it closer to the forest. In the morning, it was gone. But the cost had already been claimed. His grandmother's bed was empty. On her pillow lay a sprig of pine needles, damp with morning dew. Ethan wept, clutching the toy soldier that he had not been able to part with. Years later, when he was grown, he sometimes dreamed of the forest. The whispers never left him, always patient, always waiting, and deep down, he knew the truth. The forest had marked him. One day, whether he wished it or not, he would go back. Story 4. The Midnight Trains. Clara loved trains. As a child, she and her father would wait at the platform in their small town, just to watch the locomotives thunder past. The glow of the lamps, the rhythm of the tracks, the curious mystery of where each train might be heading, all of it fascinated her. Years later, after her father passed away, Clara still found herself drawn to train stations, particularly the old ones where fewer people went. That's how she found herself one rainy evening at the edge of town, standing before a platform she didn't recall seeing on any map. A wooden sign swayed on rusted hinges, faintly etched with the words, "Midnight Line." She hadn't planned to ride, but when the whistle blew and the train emerged from the mist, she felt the old pull again, nostalgia laced with curiosity. The train was unlike any she'd seen before. Its cars gleamed black and silver, polished as if time itself had never touched them. The windows glowed faintly, yet no passengers peered out. And when the doors opened with a slow sigh, Clara's feet moved forward before her mind had fully decided. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly of smoke and something sweet, like candied almonds. Velvet seats lined the narrow car, and little brass lamps glowed at every table. It felt welcoming. She sat down, smoothing her coat across her lap. The train lurched, and through the window, the station dissolved into darkness. The conductor appeared shortly after. He was tall, impossibly thin, and very old. So old his skin seemed carved from parchment, every wrinkle an etched memory. His uniform was black, trimmed with dull gold, and his cap bore a tarnished emblem of crossed rails. He carried a brass lantern that gave off a wavering light, though no flame burned within it. "Ticket?" he rasped. Clara blinked. I don't have one." "That's quite all right," the conductor said, his mouth twitching into something like a smile. "Not all passengers do at first." Something about his words unsettled her, though his tone was oddly gentle. She watched him shuffle on, asking no one in particular for tickets, in cars that appeared otherwise empty. When Clara tried to look behind her, down the length of the train, she saw only shadow. Ahead, the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly. Car after car swallowed in a greyish fog. Hours or minutes, she couldn't tell, slipped by. Clara pressed her forehead against the glass, trying to spot landmarks, towns, or even stars. But outside there was only blackness, as though the train rode through nothing at all. She decided she would disembark at the next stop. That decision gave her comfort, a tether of normalcy. Yet when the train slowed, it did not stop at a town. The platform she glimpsed was splintered wood, abandoned, leaning under the weight of ivy. A clock hung crooked on a post, its hands spinning slowly, never settling. The doors did not open. Clara rose, hurried to them, pressed her palms against the glass. "Excuse me," she called. "Conductor?" But the platform drifted away. The conductor appeared at her shoulder, so silently she gasped. "No stops for you," he said, his voice almost kind. Her stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Your journey's only begun." Panic stirred, though the train itself remained cozy, almost lulling in its warmth. Clara wandered through several cars, calling out, looking for other passengers. She thought she heard whispers, a laugh, the scrape of a shoe. But when she turned corners, she found only empty seats. Eventually, she returned to her own car. Something new sat upon her table, a tiny toy train, its engine and cars carved from wood, painted black and silver, like the one she rode. She picked it up. The wheels turned. Inside the miniature cars were tiny figures, their faces painted with meticulous detail. One, near the front, looked uncannily like her. Her breath caught. She placed it down and turned to the conductor, who was waiting just a few rows away. His lantern glowed brighter now, throwing long shadows across the floor. "What is this?" she demanded, pointing to the toy. The conductor tilted his head, as though considering how best to phrase something delicate. "You see?" he said softly. We are all part of his collection. Whose? Clara asked. The boys. The train groaned as if in answer, and Clara felt her body shiver with a cold that came from nowhere. She tried again to leave. She pounded the doors. She shouted. She begged. But the train kept moving, steady and unyielding, through darkness that had no end. At some point she fell asleep, or thought she did, and dreamed of a child's bedroom. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with toys, marbles, soldiers, dolls. At the center was a play train set, tracks circling endlessly around a small village. The train's cars were painted black and silver. Inside them sat tiny figures, unmoving, their painted eyes wide. And there she was, her painted likeness staring back at her from inside the toy car. She woke with a cry. The conductor stood at her side, lantern in hand. His ancient face broke into a wide, cracked smile. "He likes you," he whispered. Clara turned to the window. This time, she did not see darkness. She saw the blurred outline of a giant child's face, peering in with wide, curious eyes. The boy's hand reached down, enormous and pale, to tap the roof of the train as though testing it. The entire car rattled, knocking Clara back into her seat. Her body felt stiff, wooden, as if joints no longer bent the way they should. She tried to scream, but her voice caught like splinters in her throat. The conductor leaned close. His breath smelled of smoke and dust. "Welcome to the set, miss. You'll ride with us forever." And when the boy returned his attention to his toy train, Clara sat frozen inside, one more painted passenger, her smile carved on, and her eyes forever staring, while the midnight line circled on and on. Story 5, The Return of Ashwood Manor. The fog came early that autumn, rolling in from the river like a great grey blanket. It curled along the cobblestone streets of Hollowford, a small town where the church bell still rang on the hour, and everyone knew which bakery made the better bread. To most, the fog was nothing unusual, but to the older townsfolk, those with grey at their temples and memory still sharp, it stirred whispers. For this year marked 100 years since the last sighting of Ashwood Manor's master. The manor sat at the very edge of Hollowford, where the woods thickened and the river narrowed. For decades it had stood empty, ivy crawling up its stone walls, windows black as if they were eyes closed in endless sleep. Children dared each other to throw rocks at the gates or press a hand to the iron bars, only to dart away squealing. Adults avoided it altogether, muttering bad luck when their paths took them too close. But on this fog-drenched evening, lamps glowed within the house for the first time in a century. Mrs. Evelyn Carow, the town librarian, saw them first as she locked up. She paused on the library steps, squinting through the fog at the faint flicker of yellow light. Her heart gave a slow thump. She knew the stories well. How Lord Silas Ashwood had vanished one stormy night in 1824, leaving only rumours behind, rumours of strange appetites, of villagers found pale and lifeless near the river, of a family curse that demanded blood. Now, it seemed, he had come home. The following morning, the news had spread through Hollowford as quickly as spilled ink. The Ashwood gates were open, swept clean of rust. A carriage, black, elegant, and archaic, stood in the drive. "Impossible," scoffed the baker, Mr. Harrow. "No man lives that long." "Not a man," whispered old Mrs. Pennington, as she adjusted her shawl. "Not a man at all." By afternoon, Hollowford was in a strange state of unease. Curiosity wrestled with fear, and when the invitation came, a thick card delivered by a gloved messenger, it set the whole town abuzz. Lord Silas Ashwood requests your company this Saturday at Ashwood Manor, a gathering in honor of his return. The handwriting was exquisite, a slanting script that seemed to shimmer when the light hit it just so. Few wanted to attend, yet none dared decline, for though a century had passed, the Ashwood name still carried weight, and something in the invitation felt less like a request and more like a summons. Saturday came with an early dusk. One by one, carriages rolled toward the manor, wheels crunching over gravel. Townsfolk, stiff in their Sunday best, exchanged nervous glances as they crossed the threshold. Inside, the manor gleamed as though no dust had ever touched it. Candles blazed in golden sconces. Chandeliers shimmered, and velvet drapes framed tall windows. The scent of roses drifted faintly in the air, and then he appeared. Lord Silas Ashwood looked exactly as the portraits had shown him. Tall, elegant, with dark hair brushing his shoulders, and eyes a startling grey, almost silver. His suit was cut in the fashion of another century, yet it suited him flawlessly. His smile, when it came, was warm and disarming. "Friends," he said, voice smooth as polished oak, "how good it feels to be home." Some of the tension in the air eased, as though his words alone could soothe. Glasses of wine were pressed into hands, music drifted from the gallery, and laughter cautiously rose. The townsfolk began to wonder if the stories had been only stories after all. Only Mrs. Carrow, standing near the fire, kept her gaze fixed on him. There was something in the way his shadow clung too tightly, in how he never sipped from his glass, though it gleamed with red. As the evening deepened, Silas moved among his guests with a gracious air, speaking of the town as though he had only been gone a season. He remembered details no one had told him, whose great-grandfather built the clock tower, which family once kept the orchard by the river. His memory, it seemed, spanned not years, but centuries. At last, when the hour crept toward midnight, he raised his glass. "To Hollowford," he said. "May it remain ever faithful, as it has been through the years." The words were met with hesitant applause. Yet as the crystal chimed, Mrs. Carrow noticed three things at once. No one had heard the church bell toll midnight. The fog had pressed itself tight against the windows, thick and unmoving, and Lord Ashwood's reflection did not appear in the great mirror behind him. Her breath caught. She set down her glass, and in that instant, Silas's eyes met hers across the room. The faintest curve touched his lips, an acknowledgement, a warning, or perhaps a promise. The gathering ended without incident. Guests left the manor whispering, some giddy with relief, others uneasy but unwilling to name why. Yet in the nights that followed, Hollowford changed. Stray dogs vanished. The butcher's son was found asleep by the riverbank, pale and weak, with no memory of how he'd come there. Windows began to close earlier, doors locked at sunset. The town held its breath, and every evening, as the fog rolled in, lights burned steady in Ashwood Manor. 1 week later, Mrs. Carrow was closing the library when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Lord Ashwood himself standing in the lamplight, tall hat in hand. "Good evening, Mrs. Carrow," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "I find myself in need of your services." "You are the keeper of Hollowford's histories, are you not?" Her pulse thudded in her throat. "I am," she managed. "Splendid." His smile revealed, just for a heartbeat, the glint of sharpness behind it. "I should like to learn what has become of my town in my absence. And who better to tell me than its memory?" He extended his arm. The fog curled around them like a waiting cloak, and though every sense in her body screamed to flee, Mrs. Caro found herself placing her hand upon his sleeve, stepping into the mist at his side. From that night forward, Hollowford's library windows glowed late into the hours, as if stories were being shared long past midnight, and the townsfolk, whispering in the safety of their homes, could never decide if Mrs. Caro had become his prisoner or his confidant. Either way, the vampire had returned, and Hollowford, bound by silence and fog, belonged to him once more. Story 6. The Lake of Stillness. Marion Whitfield appeared to be no more than 28. Her pale skin glowed with a youthful bloom. Her hazel eyes carried a sharp brightness, and her dark hair fell in soft curls. Anyone who met her might think she had the enviable gift of good fortune and good skincare. But Marion had long ago learned to keep her smiles careful and her friendships shallow, because the truth of her beauty was steeped in blood. 200 years ago, she had been just like any other woman in her mountain town. She taught the village children their letters and numbers, tended her small garden, and dreamed of a life that would someday include a family of her own. But on the morning of her 28th birthday, wandering through the high ridges in search of wildflowers, she stumbled upon the lake. The lake was unlike any other, a mirror of absolute stillness. The surface never rippled, not even in the wind. It looked like polished obsidian, yet beneath the black sheen lurked a deep emerald glow, as if the waters themselves were lit from within. Marion, entranced, stepped closer. She had been so close to leaning over the water when she heard it, soft as a whisper, low as a sigh. Bring me a gift, and I will give you time. That year, a fox vanished from the forest near town. Marion carried its lifeless body into the woods, trembling with fear, and laid it at the edge of the water. The lake accepted. A swirl of green light sank the fox beneath the glass surface, and when Marion awoke the next morning, she noticed the lines at the corners of her eyes were gone. Her skin had smoothed, her energy brimmed. From then on, every year she brought a sacrifice. At first it was animals, rabbits, deer, once even a bear. But after the first decade, the lake grew hungrier. Its whisper urged for more. And so, with a heart she trained to be cold, Marion began to choose her victims. Now, 2 centuries later, Marion lived in the same cottage on the edge of the mountains. The townspeople never questioned her. Generations had passed, and those who remembered her earliest days were long gone. To them, she was a kindly recluse, a woman with a passion for old books and herbal teas. They visited her rarely, though when they did, they always remarked on her beauty, her timelessness. On the eve of her offering, Marion prepared the ritual as she always did. She lit candles in her small parlor, their golden glow casting warmth against the wooden walls. Rain pattered softly on the roof, a steady rhythm that comforted her. She brewed a pot of chamomile tea and set a loaf of sweet bread on the table. To anyone peering through the window, it would seem an evening of perfect coziness. But in her cellar, a young man sat bound to a chair, his eyes wide and tearful. He was a traveler, one who had knocked on her door earlier that week, asking for directions. Marion had smiled, welcomed him in, and given him soup. She had chosen him the moment he spoke, because his kind face would ensure no one in town would suspect her hand. "Please," he whispered, as she descended the steps with a lantern. "Please, let me go." Marion's expression softened, almost maternal. She brushed his hair from his forehead and sighed. "You're a sweet boy, truly. But you don't understand. The lake must be fed. Without it, I would wither away into nothing. And I can't." Her voice caught. but she forced it steady. I won't. That night, under a moon veiled by clouds, Marion led him through the dripping forest. The rain had ceased, leaving the air cool and damp, thick with the smell of pine and moss. Owls called in the distance, their notes carrying like mournful bells. When they reached the lake, it looked as it always had, a black mirror, still and silent, reflecting the jagged outlines of the peaks above. Marion stepped to the water's edge, lantern light trembling in her hand. The young man struggled, his cries muffled by the cloth she had tied across his mouth. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she wasn't sure whether she spoke to him or to herself. She pushed him into the water. The lake accepted instantly. The surface did not splash, but seemed to part, swallowing him whole. A green glow rippled outward, curling like smoke, then sank deep beneath the surface. The water stilled once more, pristine and calm. Marion felt the familiar warmth bloom in her chest, the tightening of her skin, the flush of youth returning to her cheeks. Relief washed over her. Another year safe, another year beautiful. She turned to leave. But that night, as she lay beneath her quilt in the soft glow of her bedside lamp, Marion could not sleep. The rain had returned, tapping on her windows like fingertips, and with it came a sound she had never heard before, a soft, watery whisper, not from the forest, but from within her home. 200 years, Marion, it breathed, curling through the dark. 200 years, and still you hunger. When will you bring yourself? Marion sat up, her heart pounding. The room smelled faintly of moss, damp and wild, as though the forest had seeped through her walls. The whisper came again, closer this time, from the shadows at the corner of her room. She wrapped her quilt tightly around her shoulders, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. The lake had never spoken inside her home before. The rules were changing. The comfort she had cultivated, the candles, the tea, the quiet life, suddenly felt thin, like paper stretched too tight. Marion closed her eyes, steadying her breath. She told herself the voice was only in her mind, a trick of guilt. Tomorrow, she would go into town, she decided. She would buy new herbs, perhaps donate some bread to the church. Normal things, human things. But as she drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed of the lake rising, spilling its black waters over the mountains, hunting her down. And in the dream, when she looked into the mirrored surface, she did not see her youthful face. She saw a woman old and withered, her eyes hollow, her mouth open in a scream that never ended. And when she woke, the sheets were damp beneath her, as if she had been lying in water. Story 7. The Doll in the Window. The bell above the door jingled softly as 12-year-old Clara stepped into Mrs. Ashby's antique shop, a narrow place that always smelled faintly of lavender sachets and old books. Dust floated like tiny fairies in the golden afternoon sunlight. The shop was cluttered but enchanting. Brass candlesticks perched beside stacks of teacups, faded quilts hung like tapestries, and clocks ticked in uneven harmony. Clara's eyes wandered, as they always did, until they landed on a glass case near the window. Inside, propped against a lace pillow, sat a doll. Its porcelain face was pale, almost luminous in the dim light, with delicate painted lips and wide glass eyes that seemed to follow her. Golden curls framed the doll's face, and it wore a small Victorian dress, cream with tiny blue ribbons. Something about the doll tugged at her. "Ah," Mrs. Ashby said, appearing from behind the counter, her voice raspy with age. "You found her. She's been waiting for the right owner." "The right owner?" Clara asked, fascinated. Mrs. Ashby smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Some things find their way to those who need them. She unlocked the case and lifted the doll out, brushing dust from its dress. Would you like to take her home? Clara nodded before she'd really thought about it. The doll felt strangely cool in her hands, heavier than she expected. Its glass eyes glimmered like tiny pools of water. That night, Clara placed the doll on the chair beside her bed. She had to admit, it looked a little eerie in the dark, but she told herself it was only her imagination. Hugging her blanket, she drifted into sleep, and that's when the dreams began. She dreamt of long hallways lined with candlelight, shadows stretching like claws across the floor. At the end of the hall stood a girl in Victorian clothing, her face hidden by her long brown hair. Clara tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The girl lifted her head slowly, revealing hollow, sorrowful eyes. When Clara woke, the doll was still sitting in the chair, its head tilted slightly, as though it had been watching her. The nightmares came every night after. Sometimes Clara dreamt she was running through the halls of an old house, chased by whispers she couldn't quite understand. Other times, the girl appeared at the foot of her bed, her pale hands clasping something red, something wet. One morning, Clara woke to find the doll not in her chair, but lying neatly on her pillow beside her. She froze, staring into its glassy eyes. She hadn't touched it. The doll's painted lips seemed almost to curve into a smile. A week passed before Clara found the courage to confide in her grandmother. Gran, the doll is strange, she whispered at the breakfast table. She makes me dream about a girl in an old dress. I think she's trying to tell me something. Her grandmother frowned, but her expression softened when she looked at Clara's pale face. Perhaps it wouldn't hurt to ask Mrs. Ashby about it. Old things sometimes carry old stories. So Clara returned to the shop, clutching the doll to her chest. The bell chimed again as she entered, and Mrs. Ashby looked up with knowing eyes. You've seen her, the shopkeeper said simply. Clara nodded, trembling. Who is she? Mrs. Ashby sighed, motioning for Clara to sit. Her name was Emily Fairchild, a wealthy man's daughter, back when this town was just a scattering of farms and cobblestone streets. She was found drowned in the lake behind their estate, only 10 years old. Clara shivered, tightening her hold on the doll. They say she carried this doll everywhere. Mrs. Ashby continued. After her death, the family left town, but the doll, well, it turned up again and again. Some say Emily's spirit lingers, searching for someone to hear her story. That night, Clara placed the doll back on her chair and whispered into the dark. Emily, if that's you, I want to listen. Her room grew colder. The shadows deepened. And then she wasn't in her bed anymore. She was back in the hallway from her dreams. Emily stood before her, hair falling in a curtain across her face. But this time, Clara didn't feel afraid. What happened to you? Clara asked gently. The girl's lips moved, soundless at first, then forming words like a sigh. My uncle pushed me into the water. Clara's heart pounded. The sorrow in Emily's eyes was heavy, endless. You don't have to be alone anymore, Clara whispered. Emily tilted her head, tears shining on her pale cheeks. Slowly, her figure began to fade, like mist caught in sunlight. The hallway dissolved into the quiet of Clara's room. The doll sat on the chair, but its eyes seemed softer now, its expression almost at peace. The nightmares stopped after that. The doll remained in Clara's room, but it no longer frightened her. Sometimes she thought she heard faint humming at night, like a lullaby sung from far away. She would close her eyes and smile, knowing Emily wasn't lonely anymore. Mrs. Ashby never asked for the doll back, and Clara never offered. She understood now. It hadn't just been waiting for any owner. It had been waiting for someone willing to remember. And Clara always would. Story 8. The Hollow Crossing. It was late September when Nora decided to take the Ridgewood Trail, a winding path through the state forest, known for its fiery autumn foliage. She wasn't an experienced hiker, but the crisp air and the promise of solitude after a long work week pulled her deeper into the woods. The first hour was uneventful. The sun filtered through red and gold leaves, the crunch of her boots keeping rhythm with the steady hum of crickets. She stopped often, taking photos of mushrooms blooming like tiny lanterns and a hawk circling above. But as the trail dipped into a darker part of the forest, the mood shifted. The air grew heavy. The trees seemed closer together, leaning in like eavesdroppers. Nora checked her phone. No signal. A hush had fallen too, swallowing the sounds of birds and insects. It was then she saw it, a figure standing just off the trail. At first she thought it was another hiker, but the proportions were wrong. Its arms a little too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were listening to something far away. Its shape flickered slightly, as though she were looking at it through rippling water. Nora froze. The figure did not move. She told herself to keep walking, not to look directly at it, but curiosity forced her eyes back. In that instant, the figure lifted a hand and pointed to the ground in front of her. The earth split open in a faint shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt. Nora blinked, but the shimmer only spread, curling upward like a curtain being drawn aside. The forest beyond looked the same, but not quite. The colors were a shade too bright, the shadows a little too long. The trees whispered in a language that sounded almost like words. She felt herself step forward before she could stop. The air on the other side was damp, cooler. When she turned, the shimmer had closed behind her. The figure was gone. The path stretched ahead, eerily familiar, but when she checked her phone again, it was dead. The screen, black as stone. At first glance, the world seemed identical to the one she'd left. Leaves, trees, the winding trail. But the silence pressed in harder here, broken only by faint echoes. When she called out, "Hello?" sound didn't carry naturally. Instead, it repeated back to her, delayed, as though someone were whispering the word, a few beats behind her own voice. Hours passed. She followed the trail, hoping to reach a road, a ranger station, anything. But every bend led only to more forest. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but when she found berries, they crumbled to dust in her hand. Streams looked clear, yet the water slid away from her lips when she tried to drink. And then she saw them, a man and woman walking just ahead, their clothes torn and faded as if from decades of wear. Relieved, Nora hurried toward them, but the closer she got, the more she realized something was off. Their steps made no sound. Their heads turned slightly, in perfect unison, though they never acknowledged her. When she tried to touch the woman's shoulder, her hand passed through air. She stumbled back, her chest tightening. Ghosts? No. She could see their eyes, and those eyes were filled with the same desperate fear she felt herself. That was when she understood. They weren't ghosts. They were others like her. People who had stepped off the trail when the figure beckoned, drawn into this hollow reflection of the real world. Nora spent what felt like days wandering that warped forest. Time blurred. Shadows lengthened, though the sun never set. Sometimes she thought she saw the figure again, standing just beyond the trees, always still, always waiting. Other times she spotted more people, lone hikers, pairs, even a small group of children, their faces pale, their movements slow. None spoke. None found the way back. At night, if it was night, the forest hummed with strange lullabies. The trees seemed to breathe, sighing in deep rhythm, and in her dreams, she saw her own apartment, her coffee mug on the counter, her bed neatly made. But she could never touch them, never open the door. Eventually, Nora stopped counting how long she had been there. The path always curved back on itself. Hunger faded. Thirst became an ache she learned to ignore. She walked alongside the silent others, caught in that endless loop of almost reality, waiting for more hikers to arrive. Sometimes, when the veil shimmered, she thought she could see the real forest again, the Ridgewood Trail, the golden leaves, the safe and ordinary world she had left behind. She would run toward it, but the shimmer would close before she reached it, sealing her in once more. And the figure would be there, watching, its head tilted, patient as ever. Nora understood now why the locals warned never to wander Ridgewood Trail alone in autumn. The forest was more than just trees. Somewhere between one world and the next, something waited, something that wanted company. If you ever find yourself on that trail and the woods fall silent, resist the urge to look. Don't follow the shimmer. Don't acknowledge the figure in the trees. Because once you step across, you'll never walk back. Story 9. The House at the Edge of the Woods. The small New England town of Hartwell was known for its charm. Brick-lined sidewalks, an old clock tower that still rang the hour, and a library that smelled of paper and dust. But at the very edge of town, where the paved streets gave way to gravel and then to forest, there sat a house most people preferred not to talk about. It wasn't ruined or abandoned. In fact, it looked as though someone cared for it. The windows were clean, the steps swept, and a wreath of dried herbs always hung on the front door, changed with the seasons. But no one had ever seen who lived there. Lights would glow in the evenings, flickering as though from candlelight, yet the curtains remained drawn tight. Emma Cartwright had grown up hearing whispers about the house at the edge of the woods. Some said it was a witch's cottage. Others claimed a family once lived there but never left, their voices now trapped in the walls. Emma, practical by nature, dismissed the stories. She had recently moved back to Hartwell after her grandmother's passing, taking over her grandmother's small bookshop. And so, when her car broke down one rainy evening on the road near the woods, she saw the house as nothing more than shelter until help could arrive. The rain fell in steady sheets, soaking her coat as she trudged toward the gate. The iron latch creaked, but the hinges swung easily, as though well oiled. The garden beyond was overgrown, but beautiful. Wild roses tangled with ivy, and a stone path led to the front steps. She raised her hand to knock, but before she could, the door opened. A woman stood there, perhaps in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose bun and a calm expression. She wore a long grey dress, the fabric old-fashioned, but neat. "You're drenched," the woman said softly. "Come in." Emma hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. A fire burned in the hearth, and shelves lined with books and jars filled the room. The atmosphere was warm, inviting, though dim. "Thank you," Emma said, brushing rain from her sleeves. "I didn't mean to intrude. My car broke down on the road." "It happens often on that road," the woman replied, closing the door. "You can wait here until the storm passes." She guided Emma into a sitting room where a pot of tea steamed on the table. The china cups were delicate, painted with faded roses. Emma accepted the offered cup, the warmth seeping into her hands. They spoke for a while, about the weather, about Hartwell, about Emma's bookshop. The woman listened attentively, her dark eyes fixed on Emma with quiet intensity. Yet when Emma asked for the woman's name, there was only a pause. "You may call me Clara," she said at last, though something in her tone suggested it was not the truth. The storm outside grew fiercer, thunder rolling like distant drums. Emma glanced at the clock on the mantel, its hands frozen at midnight, though the firelight showed it was not so late. "Has it been broken long?" she asked. Clara's lips curved faintly. "It keeps the time, that matters." The words unsettled Emma, though the fire's warmth was comforting, lulling her into drowsiness. She blinked heavily, realizing her teacup was empty, though she did not remember finishing it. When she woke, the storm had ended. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Clara sat across from her, unmoving, as if she had not shifted in hours. "You should be able to leave now," Clara said quietly. Emma stood, embarrassed at having dozed off. "Thank you again for your kindness. I'd like to return the favor sometime." Clara's gaze lingered. "Perhaps you will." Emma left the house, walking back down the stone path. The rain had washed the world clean, and her car started without protest. She drove home, shaking off the strange evening as best she could. The next day, however, curiosity gnawed at her. She mentioned the woman at the shop, describing the house and her host. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. "That house has been empty for over 100 years," said Mr. Larkin, the postmaster. "No one's lived there since the Holloway family vanished." Emma laughed nervously. "No, I spoke with her." "Clara." Mr. Larkin frowned. Clara Holloway was the eldest daughter. "She disappeared the night the family did. Folks say the woods took them." That evening, Emma drove back to the edge of the woods, determined to prove her memory right. The house stood there, unchanged, but the windows were dark, the steps thick with moss, and the door swollen with age as though it had not been opened in decades. Yet when she turned to leave, she caught sight of something in the upper window, a faint glow, like candlelight, and a woman's silhouette watching her, calm and patient. Emma hurried back to her car, heart thudding. She told herself she would never return. But that night, as she locked up the bookshop, she found something on the counter that hadn't been there before, a delicate teacup painted with faded roses, and when she lifted it, the porcelain was still warm. Story 10. The Lanterns of Penhollow. Penhollow was the kind of town that looked as if it had been painted into the hills rather than built. Its cobblestone streets glistened with dew at dawn. Its cottages leaned politely toward one another, and the old trees bent their branches low, as though eavesdropping on the lives below. What made Penhollow unusual were the lanterns. Every night, just before the church bell tolled 8, the lanterns along Main Street flickered to life on their own. No caretaker lit them. No one claimed responsibility, and yet they burned. Soft amber globes that swayed as if stirred by invisible hands. Children dared each other to touch them, but no one ever did. Even the bravest stopped just short, saying the light hummed against their skin like a warning. Eleanor Graves, who had lived in Penhollow all her 46 years, knew better than to linger by those lamps. Her grandmother had told her the rule when she was small: when the lanterns glow, be home. When the bells toll, lock your door. Eleanor followed that rule faithfully until the autumn when Penhollow began to change. It started subtly. The lanterns, once steady in their glow, began to flicker erratically. Some nights, they cast long shadows that stretched too far across the cobblestones, reaching windows and curling under doors. Eleanor noticed whispers carried on the wind, like dry leaves brushing together. People claimed to hear their names spoken, soft as breath, when they passed beneath the lamps. Then came the disappearances. Mrs. Wickham, the baker's wife, failed to return from delivering a late loaf. A schoolboy named Thomas vanished on his walk home. Search parties scoured the hills and marshes, but no tracks or signs remained, only the lanterns swaying in the night, brighter than ever. Still, life in Penhollow pressed on. The townsfolk whispered their prayers, tightened their curtains, and told themselves the old rules would keep them safe. But Eleanor had grown restless. On the first night of frost, Eleanor sat in her parlour with the fire burned low. Outside, the lanterns flickered in patterns she had never seen before, almost like a pulse, quick and uneven. Against her better judgment, she left her chair, wrapped her shawl, and stepped outside. The air was brittle and cold, the moon sharp as bone above the roofs. Eleanor walked down the lane until she reached the first lantern. It swayed though there was no wind. The glass panes fogged as if something inside were breathing. "Who's there?" she asked before she could stop herself. The lantern flared, and for an instant she saw a face pressed against the glass, pale, wide-eyed, and soundless, mouthing words she couldn't hear. She stumbled back, clutching her shawl, but the lantern dimmed to its usual glow. That night, Eleanor dreamed of the missing townsfolk. They stood in a long row, hands clasped, their bodies glowing faintly like embers. Each held a lantern in their palms, the light seeping through their fingers as though it belonged to them now. One by one, they turned their faces toward her, and Eleanor felt the weight of their hollow eyes. She woke gasping, her curtains swaying though her window was latched. The next evening, she went again. Curiosity pulled harder than fear. She stopped beneath the same lantern, and this time, when the glass fogged, she pressed her own hand against it. Cold, colder than ice. The face appeared again, this time Thomas, the schoolboy, his lips moving slowly. She leaned close, straining to hear. "Come," he mouthed. "Come with us." The lantern light flared, and Eleanor's reflection dissolved. For a heartbeat, she saw an endless black corridor, filled with swaying lanterns, each one cradling a figure inside. They glowed faintly, their eyes closed, as though dreaming. She jerked her hand away. The vision vanished. Over the following days, Eleanor kept to her routines but could not banish the pull of that otherworldly corridor. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of the disappearances. Some suggested leaving Penhollow altogether, though no one ever did. The town was bound to its rules, its rhythms, its shadows. On the final night of October, when mist coiled thick through the streets, Eleanor made her choice. She wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl, lit a candle, and stepped into the fog. The lanterns glowed brighter than ever, humming like a chorus. She walked down Main Street, past shuttered windows, until she reached the old stone well at the square. The largest lantern hung there, swaying above the dark mouth of the well. Eleanor touched the glass. The cold shot through her bones, but this time she did not pull away. The lantern flared, the corridor appeared, and she saw her grandmother there, waiting, smiling faintly, her lantern-light body glowing with quiet warmth. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. All those she had lost stood in the endless row, hands outstretched, their faces calm, almost peaceful. "Come," they mouthed again. And so she did. Her candle guttered out in the mist. The lantern swung once, twice, and steadied. By morning, Penhollow found her gone. The townsfolk shook their heads, bolted their doors tighter, and whispered the rule again to their children. When the lanterns glow, be home. When the bells toll, lock your door. But if you visit Penhollow on a misty autumn night and dare to look closely, you might see Eleanor's face glowing faintly behind the glass, watching, waiting, and whispering to the next soul who lingers too long. Story 11. The Boy in Ashgrove. The town of Ashgrove always looked the same, no matter the season. Quaint cottages with ivy climbing their chimneys, cobbled streets lined with lamplight, and a small square where people gathered for weekly markets. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where neighbours baked too many pies and left them on your doorstep, where children played until the church bell rang for supper. But Ashgrove had one rule, spoken softly to newcomers and taught firmly to children. Never answer when the boy calls your name. No one remembered exactly when he had come. The oldest resident said he'd always been there, a shadow of a child who darted through the alleyways and across the town green at dusk. He looked about 7 years old, round cheeks, brown hair flopping into his eyes, always wearing a threadbare coat and muddy boots as if he'd just come in from play. His laugh was the kind you'd hear on a spring afternoon, bright and clear. But the laugh never came from where you expected. Sometimes it echoed down a well, or rang from the branches of the elm tree by the square, or carried through your own chimney late at night. And then he'd say your name. The blacksmith's wife once told a newcomer that the boy had called for her when she was a girl. "He sounded just like my brother," she whispered, eyes glassy. I almost answered, but I bit my tongue, and when I didn't speak, I saw him, standing outside my window, smiling at me through the glass. What happened to those who answered? The townsfolk didn't know for certain, only that they disappeared. Some were children, others grown men and women, but all were gone by morning, with no trace left behind. Despite this, Ashgrove never felt like a place of terror. The market still bustled. The air always smelled of bread from the bakery, and visitors often commented how cozy the town seemed. It was the sort of place you wanted to linger. The townspeople were warm, though their smiles held a hint of caution, like a secret tucked behind their teeth. One autumn evening, when the fog curled thick around the cobblestones, a little girl named Charlotte was walking home from her grandmother's house. She held her lantern carefully, listening to the sound of her own footsteps. That was when she heard it, a child's laugh carried on the mist. Then, softly, as though from just behind her, Charlotte. Her heart thumped. She gripped the lantern tighter and walked faster, remembering the rule. Don't answer. The boy's voice followed her. Charlotte, wait for me. Let's play. She hurried up the lane, her small boots clicking against the stone. The voice grew closer, warmer, almost like her cousins when they played hide and seek. At last, she reached her front door. Her father was waiting on the porch, a pipe in hand. His face paled when he saw her trembling. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He only placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Good girl." He kept quiet. From the edge of the street, the boy was watching. He smiled, his face soft and round, his eyes shining like candlelight. Then he vanished into the fog. Life went on in Ash Grove. Children grew up, families grew old, markets continued in the square. But the boy never left. He was part of the town, as constant as the church bell, as familiar as the ivy on the chimneys. People learned to live with him, baking bread, tending gardens, singing hymns, while always carrying that quiet rule in their hearts. Never answer when the boy calls your name, for he is waiting, always waiting, to make a new friend. And in Ash Grove, everyone knew, sooner or later, he would call for you. Story 12. The Boy in the Park. The move had been good for Alex and his mom. Their new house was smaller, a bit older, with creaky floors and a porch that leaned slightly to the left, but it felt safe. After the chaos of the past year, his parents' divorce, switching schools, and leaving his best friend behind, Alex was grateful for anything that felt steady. Best of all, their house sat right next to a little park. It wasn't much, just 2 rusted swing sets, a crooked jungle gym, and an old oak tree whose branches spread out like welcoming arms. But it was enough to distract him while his mom unpacked boxes and made endless phone calls in her new job's sharp, businesslike tone. On his first morning, Alex wandered over to the park with a ball tucked under his arm. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, and the slide still dripped from last night's rain. That was when he saw the other boy. He looked about Alex's age, maybe 9 or 10, with dark hair that stuck up in the back and a shirt too big for his narrow shoulders. He was sitting on one of the swings, moving slowly back and forth without really kicking off the ground. "Hi," Alex called, trying not to sound too eager. The boy looked up and smiled. "Hi." "I just moved in." Alex pointed toward the house next door. "I know," the boy said, as if he'd been expecting him. "Want to play?" They started with catch, tossing the ball back and forth until Alex's arms ached. The boy was quick and agile, though he never laughed when he missed, just tilted his head with a puzzled look, like he hadn't expected the ball to slip through his hands. Afterward, they climbed the oak tree. The boy darted up the trunk easily, as if he'd done it 1,000 times, then perched on a branch and waited for Alex to catch up. They stayed until Alex's mom called him for dinner, her voice floating through the open kitchen window. The next day, the boy was there again, and the next. At school, Alex struggled to fit in. The kids already had their circles, their inside jokes, their teams. But each afternoon when the final bell rang, he knew he'd have someone waiting for him at the park. The boy never mentioned his family, and Alex realized he'd never actually seen him leave. He was just always there. One chilly October evening, Alex sat cross-legged in the sandbox while the boy dug trenches with his hands. "You know," Alex said, "you should come over sometime. We could play video games, or you could meet my mom." The boy froze mid-scoop, then shook his head. "I can't go inside." "Why not?" "Just can't." His voice was soft, final. Alex frowned but let it drop. It was Alex's mom who first noticed something odd. "I'm glad you've made a friend," she said one night over spaghetti. "But what's his name?" Alex's fork paused in midair. I don't know." She gave him a look. "You've been playing with him every day for 2 weeks." "I know, but he never told me." His mom smiled, though uneasily. "Well, maybe you should ask tomorrow. Seems like an important detail." That night, Alex dreamed of the park. The oak tree stretched higher than the clouds, its roots twisting down into the dark earth like giant hands. The boy was there, waiting on the swing, his face pale under the moonlight. "Don't ask," the boy whispered. Alex woke with a start, his sheets damp with sweat. The next day, curiosity got the better of him. As they sat on the swings, Alex kicked at the gravel. "Hey," he asked casually. "What's your name?" The boy's head snapped toward him. His smile faded. "I told you not to ask." Alex felt a chill crawl up his spine. "No, you didn't." The boy looked down at his hands, twisting them together. "They don't like it when you say names." "Who doesn't?" "The ones who keep me here." His voice was barely a whisper, his gaze darting toward the shadows pooling under the oak tree. Alex swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" The boy stood abruptly. "I should go." And then, just like that, he was gone. No footsteps, no rustle of leaves, just gone. That night, Alex couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too still, and every creak in the walls made his heart pound. Finally, he padded to the living room, where his mom sat at the dining table with her laptop. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "did anything happen here? Like, in the park?" His mom frowned. "What do you mean?" "Like, did someone ever—" He struggled for the right words. "Did someone die there?" Her expression shifted, a shadow crossing her face. She closed the laptop. "Who told you that?" "No one," Alex lied. "I was just wondering." She sighed. "It was a long time ago, Alex. Before you were born, a little boy wandered away from his house, and they found him in the park, by the oak tree." She reached out, smoothing Alex's hair. "It's not something you need to worry about." But Alex's stomach churned. He didn't need to ask what the boy's name had been. Somehow, he already knew. The next day, Alex went back to the park. The boy was there, sitting on the swing, waiting as always. But something in his eyes had changed, darker, sadder. "You're not supposed to know," the boy said softly. "I didn't mean to," Alex whispered. I like being your friend." The boy studied him for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. "I like being yours too." For a second, it felt almost normal. Two kids, side by side, the chains of the swings creaking gently in the autumn wind. But when Alex blinked, the boy was gone. The swing beside him moved back and forth, empty, though no breeze stirred the air. And Alex knew, deep down, that the boy would always be there, waiting. Story 13. The Library After Hours.
Bridget had always thought the town library was the safest place in the world. Its old brick walls and high arched windows were her refuge, especially during high school when she'd slip inside to escape arguments at home. Books were orderly in ways people never seemed to be. So when Mrs. Hawthorne, the elderly head librarian, asked her to take on a new part-time job at the front desk, Bridget didn't hesitate. The hours were odd. She was expected to cover from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. But the pay was good, and Mrs. Hawthorne had winked when Bridget asked why so late. "You'll see," the woman said, pushing a brass key across the desk. "It's quieter then." The first night, Bridget arrived to find the library empty, as expected. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The rows of books sat perfectly still. She made herself tea from the staff room and sat up at the desk with a paperback. But at midnight, the heavy oak doors creaked open. A man shuffled in, his coat frayed, his hair wet from rain. Bridget froze. She hadn't heard a key in the lock. "Hello?" she said cautiously. The man tipped his head without looking at her and headed straight to the history shelves. Something about him seemed hazy, as though the air shimmered faintly around him. When he walked past the overhead lights, they dimmed. He pulled a thick, leather-bound book from the shelf and brought it to the desk. His fingers left no smudges on the cover. "Do you have a library card?" Bridget asked, trying to sound professional. He gave her a look, sad, resigned, and opened the book to the title page. Written there in faded ink was his name. Beneath it, in spidery handwriting, was the story of a man who drowned in the quarry in 1912. Bridget's heart skipped. When she looked up, the man was gone. The book remained. By the third night, Bridget realized Mrs. Hawthorne hadn't been joking. The library opened itself after midnight, not for the living townsfolk, but for the dead. They drifted in quietly, one by one, choosing books that told their unfinished stories. Some lingered at tables, whispering to themselves as though practicing words they never got to say. Others carried their chosen books to the desk, letting Bridget hold them briefly before they vanished, book in hand, into some place she couldn't see. They weren't frightening. If anything, they seemed grateful. Yet there was always a hush in the air, a chill that raised goosebumps along her arms. Bridget told herself she could handle it. Ghosts checking out books was strange, but not dangerous. That was before she noticed her family name in the catalog. It was a quiet Tuesday night when she wandered back into the genealogical section. Her tea had gone cold, her nerves buzzing from too much silence. She ran her fingers along the spines until one title caught her breath. The Ashwood Family of Penhollow, Unfinished Lives. Her last name. The book was older than she expected, bound in cracked leather, the pages yellowed. She carried it carefully back to the desk. Inside, she found chapters devoted to her grandparents, her great-grandparents, cousins she'd never met. Most entries ended with neat, somber summaries, but then she found her mother's name. The page was blank. No birth date. No story. Just a single line written in ink that seemed fresher than the rest. Her story remains unfinished. Bridget's stomach twisted. Her mother was alive, just 3 streets over, constantly tired, constantly worried, but very much alive. Why would her name be here? And then, below that line, was her own name, Bridget Ashwood, also unfinished. That night, she couldn't stop checking the doors, expecting something, or someone, to arrive asking for the Ashwood book. At one point, she swore she saw a figure in the window glass, standing just behind her, though no one was there when she turned. When Mrs. Hawthorne came in at 3 a.m. to relieve her, Bridget pushed the book across the desk. "Why is this here?" Bridget asked, her voice shaking. The old woman's eyes softened. Every family has its volume. Not everyone wants to see theirs. "My mom's story. It isn't finished." "Why would it be here already?" Mrs. Hawthorne closed the book gently. "Because some endings wait in silence, Bridget, and some can be changed, if you pay attention." Over the next week, Bridget worked every night, dreading and anticipating the moment someone might ask for her family's book. None did, but she noticed changes in her mother during the day. How pale she looked, how often she coughed. Bridget asked if she was okay, but her mother waved her off. The unfinished line pressed at her mind. Finally, Bridget brought the book home. She opened it at the kitchen table and read until the ink blurred her eyes. There was no clear prediction, no dates, only fragments, hints of choices that could lead toward shadows or away from them. Her mother came downstairs late, rubbing her temples. "Why are you up?" Bridget stared at her. "Mom, are you sick?" The silence stretched long. Her mother finally sat, hands trembling. "I didn't want to worry you. The doctor found something. They're still running tests." Bridget's throat tightened. "We'll go through it together." She placed her hand over her mother's. The book on the table seemed to hum faintly, as though acknowledging her words. The next night at the library, when the doors opened and the spirits shuffled in, Bridget kept the Ashwood book close. She half expected someone, some ghostly ancestor, to reach for it, but none did. Instead, when her shift ended, she noticed something new. On her mother's page, faint words had appeared beneath, "Her story remains unfinished. She has chosen to keep living." Bridget closed the book with tears in her eyes. Working the night desk never grew less strange. The dead still came, carrying their sorrows and hopes in fragile, crumbling books. But Bridget found comfort in it now. Each story was a reminder that life wasn't only about how it ended. It was about how much remained unwritten. And every morning, when she locked the library doors behind her, she carried that reminder home, determined to fill her own pages and her mother's with as many chapters as she could.
Story 14. The Bakery in the Fogs. On certain mornings in the town of Weathervane, the fog rolled in so thick you could taste it on your tongue. It muted the world into soft outlines, as though the streets, houses, and lampposts had been brushed with watercolors and left unfinished. Most folks stayed indoors until the sun returned, but if you happened to be walking the cobbled lanes at dawn, you might see it, a bakery that wasn't there the day before. It stood at the end of the crooked lane by the churchyard. Its windows glowed a warm amber, and a painted sign above the door read simply, "The Village Oven." No one remembered the shop in clear weather, and when asked, townsfolk argued over whether it was ever there at all. But those who entered on a foggy morning never forgot the taste of its pastries. Nora was one of those people who woke early, her hands restless, until they were wrapped around a warm mug of tea. On a particularly foggy Wednesday, she pulled on her coat and decided to take a walk. The mist curled down her collar and dampened her hair, and that's when she saw the golden light ahead. The scent reached her before the door did. Honey, butter, sugar, and something richer, deeper, like roasted chestnuts in winter. She stepped inside. The bakery was small but cozy, lined with shelves of golden loaves, sugared buns, and pastries so delicate they looked spun from lace. Behind the counter stood a woman with flour on her hands and a smile as warm as the oven's. "You've found us," the woman said, as though she'd been expecting Nora. "What will it be today?" Nora ordered a small pastry, no larger than her palm. The woman wrapped it in brown paper tied with twine, and when Nora bit into it outside, the flavor burst like sunlight through the fog. Sweet cream, tart berries, and something else she couldn't name, but which made her heart ache with longing. That night, Nora dreamed. She found herself walking through a village she had never seen before. Its streets were winding, its cottages quaint, with thatched roofs and flowering gardens, and in the square stood a fountain with water that shimmered silver beneath the moon. Children laughed in the distance, and lanterns swayed in the breeze. The place was impossibly lovely, like the memory of a storybook. When she woke, the dream clung to her. She could recall every detail, sharper than her own kitchen. The fog returned 2 days later. So did the bakery. This time, Nora bought a sugared twist, warm and fragrant, the cinnamon sticking to her fingers. That night, her dream village grew larger. She saw the bookshop with its crooked sign, the inn with ivy on its eaves, the villagers who greeted her as though she belonged, and she wanted to. The third time she tried to resist. She told herself it was silly, just a dream conjured by a wandering mind. But when the fog came, the smell of pastries filled her chest with hunger, and she found herself at the door again. The baker greeted her with that same knowing smile, as though Nora had finally stopped fighting. "You'll want the brioche today," the woman said, placing it into her hands without waiting for her order. Nora ate it while the mist pressed against her windows, and that night, her dream was so vivid, it felt more real than waking life. She saw her own reflection in the fountain, dressed not in her modern clothes, but in a simple dress of linen and wool. She lived in a small cottage near the square. Neighbors called her name as she walked by. She was part of the village, and for the first time in years, she felt truly at home. Weeks passed. Nora stopped speaking much of her dreams. Her friends noticed her distraction, the faraway look in her eyes, the way she lingered on foggy mornings as though waiting for something. "You've been different," one of them remarked, sleepwalking through the day. Nora smiled faintly. Not sleepwalking, sleep living. The fog thickened more often now. The bakery appeared like clockwork, its windows glowing brighter each time. Nora wasn't the only customer. She began to notice others too, each hunched over their wrapped parcels, each with the same dreamy expression. They never spoke to one another, only exchanged brief nods of recognition, as though they shared a secret too fragile for words. One morning, Nora lingered after paying. "Where is it?" she asked the baker softly. The woman wiped flour from her hands and tilted her head. "Where is what?" "The village, the one in the dreams." The baker smiled in that way of hers, kind, patient, inevitable. "It's where you already are." That night, Nora dreamed again. She stood in the square, the fountain gleaming. Lanterns swung overhead. The villagers gathered, their faces familiar now, their voices calling her home. She walked to her cottage, opened the door, and smelled fresh bread cooling on the table. She didn't wake. The next morning, the fog lifted early. The street where the bakery usually stood was empty. No golden glow, no painted sign, only damp cobblestones glistening in the sunlight. Nora's friends knocked at her door and received no answer. They searched, asked neighbors, even checked with the post, but she was simply gone. In time, they stopped speaking of it. People go missing sometimes after all. But on foggy mornings, when the air grew thick and soft, if you walked by the crooked lane, you might see a golden light shining through the mist. And if you entered, you might notice the baker smiling as she handed a loaf to a young woman in a linen dress, her hair braided neatly down her back. The woman might turn, just for a moment, and you would think you recognized her. But then the fog would close in again, and the village oven would vanish, leaving you wondering if it had ever been there at all. Story 15. The Rocking Chair in the Corner.
Eleanor and David had been searching for the perfect retreat. After years of city noise and cramped apartments, they longed for quiet, a place with charm, somewhere they could read by the fire and fall asleep to the sound of wind in the trees. The cottage appeared almost by accident. Tucked down a narrow, winding lane, it looked as though it had grown out of the forest itself. Its stone chimney leaned slightly, ivy hugged the walls, and lace curtains still hung in the windows. The realtor explained that the previous owners had left in a hurry, and much of the furniture came with the house. "That just adds to the charm," David said cheerfully, squeezing Eleanor's hand. She wasn't so sure. Something about the idea of living among strangers' belongings made her uneasy, but the warmth of the little rooms, the shelves stuffed with books, the teacups waiting in the cabinets, softened her doubts. And when she saw the rocking chair in the corner of the sitting room, upholstered in faded floral fabric, she thought of cozy evenings with tea, knitting, and firelight. They signed the papers the next day. The first night was quiet. Crickets sang outside, and the woods pressed close around the cottage. They unpacked only what was necessary: pajamas, toothbrushes, a bottle of wine. As Eleanor drifted towards sleep, she heard it. A gentle creak, creak, from the sitting room below. She nudged David. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" he mumbled, already half asleep. "The rocking chair. It's moving." David chuckled. Old house noises. Go back to sleep. But Eleanor lay awake, listening. The rhythm was unmistakable. Slow, steady rocking, like someone keeping watch through the night. By morning, the chair was still. Sunlight slanted through the windows, gilding the dust motes. Eleanor went downstairs alone. She stood before the chair. Its cushions looked slightly indented, as though someone had just risen from it. She brushed her hand over the fabric. Cold. David came in with 2 mugs of coffee. "Admiring your throne?" "It's not mine," she said softly. That evening, they built a fire and settled in with books. The chair sat in the corner, empty but watchful. Eleanor couldn't stop glancing at it, half expecting it to begin moving even in the warmth of the firelight. When night fell and they climbed the narrow staircase to bed, she whispered, "What if someone used to sit there?" "Every night. That's what chairs are for," David teased, kissing her forehead. "You're letting this place get to you." But Eleanor couldn't shake the thought. The rocking began again after midnight. This time, David heard it too. He sat up, eyes wide. "Okay," he admitted. "That's strange." The creaking went on, unhurried and steady. Neither of them slept much that night. The next morning, they agreed to move the chair. Together, they carried it to the back room, a little parlor with no fireplace, and closed the door. "That should do it," David said firmly. But when Eleanor came down for tea that evening, the chair was back in the sitting room corner, facing the fire. She called David. "I didn't move it," he swore. They stared at it, at the worn arms and faded fabric. It sat perfectly still, as though nothing had happened. Over the following days, the cottage seemed to settle around them. They hung their coats by the door, stacked books on the shelves, and started to believe the house was theirs. But every night, the chair rocked. Eleanor began to notice something else. When she passed the chair, she sometimes caught the faintest scent of lavender and wood smoke, and when the chair rocked, she felt not threatened, but watched, as though the house itself was waiting. "Waiting for who?" she whispered one night, her eyes on the chair. It was on the 7th night that Eleanor woke with a start. She thought she'd heard a A woman's voice, low and hushed, coming from downstairs. David slept on beside her. She crept down the staircase, heart thudding. The fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly. The rocking chair swayed back and forth. And in the chair, just for a moment, she thought she saw the outline of someone. A woman, her features blurred by shadow. "Who are you?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. The rocking slowed, then stopped. The room was empty. The next day, she searched the cottage. In the small attic under the eaves, she found a box of letters, bundled with string. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but she could just make out the handwriting. "To my dearest Thomas." The letters spoke of waiting. A woman who kept the fire burning each night for a husband who never came home. He had gone to war, and she had promised to wait for him in the chair by the fire. The last letter ended abruptly, ink blurred by what might have been tears. Eleanor sat back on her heels. She could almost see it. The young woman rocking each night, staring into the woods, listening for footsteps that never came. That night, Eleanor placed the bundle of letters gently on the chair. The rocking began as usual, but this time it was different, slower, softer, almost like a sigh. When morning came, the letters were gone, and the chair never rocked again. Eleanor and David lived many happy years in the cottage. They told guests about the charming old furniture, the cozy fireplace, the quiet woods, but they never spoke of the rocking chair in the corner, or how the house had once waited for someone who would never come home. And sometimes, when the fire burned low, Eleanor thought she still smelled lavender and wood smoke, faint as memory.
Thank you for spending the night at Whispering Cabins. If you enjoyed these cozy chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and return for more tales that whisper between comfort and fear. Until next time, keep the fire low, the blankets close, and listen carefully. The night always has more to say.